Good morning, welcome back to IndyCar on the 3rd of December. Now, austerity seems to be in the headlines most recently. Austerity is something which we thought we actually got past, but remember that since George Osborne came to be the Chancellor back in 2011, austerity continued all the way through from 2011 to 2017. But now the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the new Tory Chancellor of the Exchequer, has announced in his budget that we're returning to the dark days of budget cuts. And this is something which I think we probably should have expected, because the British state run by the Tories has basically used up all of its money supply. Its ability to print money to do whatever it needed to do. For a country that's already colossally in debt to the tune of trillions of pounds, the money markets themselves must have looked at the British government and its issuing of bonds and said to them, look, you can't keep printing money, you're going to have to do something to steady the ship, because otherwise people will not want to buy UK government bonds, and they will see the British state as teetering on the brink of bankruptcy, which of course it is anyway. So we see austerity returning. Now, what does austerity mean? Well, I think we all know what it means. It basically means that the budget is being cut. Now, the budget is being cut in England dramatically. We already know this. And there are scare stories all across the United Kingdom, but particularly from south of the border, in which local authorities there are terrified of the fact that they may end up unable to balance local authority budgets. Now, that would mean that in technical terms, those local authorities in England would go bankrupt. They would not be able to produce a balanced budget. And if they went bankrupt, that would be a huge problem for everyone living in those constituencies. And the question remains, is that possible in Scotland? Could the same thing happen here? And the answer to that, well, technically it's no, because under the Scottish legal system, local authorities are actually required by law to produce a balanced budget. So they're not technically permitted to actually go bankrupt. However, if they got to the stage where they told the Scottish government that the funding coming from the Barnett formula, in other words, the formula that's used to calculate how much money Scotland should get back from its taxes from England in order to run its internal and external economy for the next 12 months, if that budget was so badly cut that they couldn't give the local authorities what they actually need to survive, then those local authorities would be unable to balance their budgets and would need to tell the Scottish government that. And interestingly, the Scottish Parliament, that is the civil service operating from Holyrood, would need to take over administration of any local authorities which were unable to balance their budgets. Now, it's technically possible that that might happen, and of course nobody really wants that to happen. Nobody wants to cut public services, and all of the COSLA members, that's the Council of Scottish Local Authorities, or Confederation of Scottish Local Authorities, I beg your pardon, has said that making people redundant and cutting the numbers of staff in Scottish local authorities is not an option. The Scottish Government has replied by saying that they have increased funding to Scottish local authorities by about 3.5% in real terms. However, the Scottish local authorities need more than that, because costs are spiralling, labour costs are going up, the cost of living has gone up dramatically, taxations have gone up on things like tobacco with alcohol, and all kinds of other strictures are being applied now to everyone living in the United Kingdom, which is making life very expensive and very much more difficult for local authorities to operate. So they could, in theory, or we could in theory see some local authorities ending up unable to balance the books. And we've already seen one particular Tory-administered council in Scotland, in Stirling, I believe, suggesting that the only way to survive in the next 12 months would be for them to close every single library and public leisure centre in that area except for one library. And that, of course, has been rejected roundly by just about everyone living in the constituency, which leaves Stirling teetering on the edge of bankruptcy already, according to its Tory administration. Now, while all this is going on, the United Kingdom's media in Scotland, and we're talking about the BBC and the broadsheet newspapers and the tabloids, are all gleefully attacking the Scottish Government, saying that it's not able to fund its own public services and it must be their fault. conveniently neglecting the fact that the Scottish Government relies for all of its funding on the United Kingdom Government, which is cutting the funding. So here we are back in the same old situation where the British media basically criticises the Scottish Government for being unable to provide funding to its local authorities, but conveniently omits the real reason for this, which is the fact that the British Government has cut the funding to the Scottish Government. So, you know, it's same old situation, but it's going to get much worse than it was before. When George Osborne was the Chancellor, or became the Chancellor in 2011, there was a lot more in the way of public sector spending with which to initiate cuts. There was more to cut. But of course, since then, and since 2017, when that period of austerity supposedly ended, the cuts that were made back then have obviously got rid of any spare capacity that was in the local authority system and the public health service and so on. And so there's nothing left to cut. And because there's nothing left to cut, the next round of austerity is going to be much, much worse, and it's going to make it virtually impossible for a country like Scotland, which values its public services so highly and maintains the funding for them in normal circumstances. It's going to be impossible for them to keep doing that. Cue the BBC writing in and saying, oh, the Scottish Government, it's their fault that the local authorities don't have enough money, which of course is a lie, as we know. So where do we go from here? What happens if the Labour Party wins the next general election? Surely that will mean the end of austerity. Labour will usher in a period of reinvestment in public services. No. So Keir Starmer's already said quite categorically that he's not going to turn the money taps on if he becomes the next Prime Minister. So that means that no matter what the result of the general election in the United Kingdom next year, even if there is a Labour Party government in position, austerity will remain in place. So Labour has basically abandoned all the principles that it once had, if it had any at all, and is now essentially become the red Tory party, and is basically trying to attract the votes of Tory voters in the southeast of England by being just as far right as the Tories, as we already knew. So this is going to cause huge problems in Scotland, because anything that happens in England is reflected here in a drop in funding. Now that also switches attention onto the Scottish Health Service, which, as the UK media has been gleefully saying for years and years, that the Scottish Government is struggling to fund it. Again, neglecting to tell us why they're struggling to fund it, but of course we all know the reason for that. But that means that the Tory administration in London is now eyeing up the Scottish NHS as a prime candidate as part of their massive health privatisation plans for the future. Now we know that the Tories are planning a massive privatisation push in England's NHS, and the Scottish NHS, although it's independent and it's run by the Scottish Parliament, is nonetheless still similarly affected by drops in funding for the English NHS, and they're reflected in the funding that we get. And that means that the Scottish NHS is going to be just as vulnerable to privatisation, and of course the British media is going to keep attacking the Scottish Government and the Scottish Health Service, saying that it's on the brink of collapse. And what do you know, the solution to that is going to be bringing in some American health insurance corporations to provide private health care in Scotland as a solution to this problem. Now this problem, of course, doesn't exist in a vacuum. The problem has been created by underfunding on a deliberate level by the UK government, which wants the privatisation of its own NHS so that it doesn't have to spend any money on it. And that means there'll be a two-tier health system, just like the failed system in the United States, where the wealthy can afford the best treatment and the rest of us have to put up with a sort of safety net type of health service with the very basic treatments available only if you're desperate or dying, and most of the rest of the health service unavailable to the people who can't afford private health insurance. And that is really what the future is for Scotland if we remain in this union any longer. The only possibility of resurrecting Scotland from this situation is if our politicians decided to grow a backbone and say that a vote count in the next general election for any independence party will result in the ending of the union. However, I'm not confident that they're going to do that, since they're not allowed to do that because they are effectively a British government, or a branch of the British government in Scotland, and they've sworn an oath not to do anything to threaten the Union. And that leaves us with one option only when it comes to voting, and that would be what's known as direct democracy. And in direct democracies, what happens is you elect individual candidates, not parties, but individual candidates to represent the views of the constituents of that area. Now, if those individual candidates are not members of parties, they may stand as independents, literally exactly what it sounds like on the tin. But an independent can obviously have a manifesto, and in that manifesto, if every independent candidate had a manifesto pledge that supported independence, and if they won a seat, or if there was a vote majority, that they would get together, all these independent candidates, and actually end the Union. That is one way of doing it, but it's very, very unlikely to happen, because the party political system that has been built up in Scotland since the introduction of devolution is based heavily, or at least partially, on the British system, which is first past the post. In other words, whoever wins the most seats basically wins government. So in the first past the post system, in the Scottish voting system, half of the votes are done first past the post. Now that means that whoever wins in the first round, the most number of seats, gets to form the government, and in the second round of voting, if you like, the second count, the other smaller parties, whoever has the most votes, they start to pick up seats. Now, this is a method of making sure that there is always British opposition to SNP majorities in Holyrood. And because of that, we can't really ever get independence this way. The only person who ever broke the system was, of course, Alex Salmond back in 2011, when he actually produced for the SNP an outright majority of all votes. He actually won the majority and formed a majority government. And that's the reason why we had the first independence referendum, because the Scottish government at the time had the chance to do it. Alex Salmond managed to get David Cameron to agree to it, and David Cameron, of course, thought they couldn't possibly lose and agreed. And so that's why we got the first independence referendum. However, there's not going to be another independence referendum at all, because the British government can no longer afford to say yes to that, because they know they would probably lose it. So the situation we have at the moment leaves us without a viable political means of getting independence through normal party political channels. And unless something changes within the 2 or 3 major independence parties and some kind of consensus breaks out, then I don't see very much hope of that happening next year. It is entirely possible, of course, that if they get an absolute gubbing next year, they might finally wake up and say, look, if you really want independence, we're going to have to work together. But that again relies on us putting pressure on our own political parties to do something about it. And that, of course, relies on the politicians having some spine and a little bit of courage of their convictions and being prepared to go up against the British government in a vote count majority, not a seat count majority. Seat count majority might be possible and may well actually happen in the next general election, but it's not a vote count. And you might end up with a seat victory in first past the post elections next year, where the SNP could take all of the seats and yet still not have more than 50% of the vote. That's the way the system works. So we already know that the British government itself has rejected what's known as the Thatcher Doctrine, and that stated that all Scotland needed if it wished to become independent was to return a majority of Scottish SNP MPs to Westminster. That has been done several times, and none of those times has it ever resulted in independence. In fact, none of those majorities of seats and those SNP majorities in Westminster have ever resulted in the SNP saying, well, we did what Thatcher said, we're declaring our independence. Nope, it never happened. So that isn't going to happen next year. It can't, because there's no political party in Scotland prepared to do that, and the British state wouldn't accept it anyway. As I've mentioned several times, it needs to be a majority of the votes, and thereby lies the rub. We need to have everybody voting for independence, and if the political parties are not willing to agree that independence is the only manifesto pledge that they will actually agree to, then there isn't really a great hope of achieving that next year. So that leaves us with the next parliamentary election in Holyrood with this gerrymandered voting system, and that would require, again, a vote count in both the first and second choice votes. And to do that requires consensus, it requires cooperation between the three major independence parties and some of the smaller ones, and any independent candidates who might be standing on an independence ticket. All of that still needs to be done. Unless it's done, it cannot succeed. There needs to be a process for gaining independence. It must be clear to the voters. The voters must know when they vote for these individuals or parties in any general election that it is independence they're voting for, not just that candidate. It is an independence vote, and thereby, if a vote majority is achieved, independence should be declared, not negotiated, simply declared. The union is over, Scotland is leaving, that's the end of the story, and then set about separating ourselves from, shall we say, the aggressor state which is plundering our resources. So we're in a sticky wicket as usual, and it's going to get worse, unfortunately. I wish I had good news for you, but I don't see it in the news at the moment. All I see is worsening conditions in the UK, and it's going to get much, much worse over the next few years of this hyper-austerity. And if Sir Keir Starmer is as good as his word, it'll continue all the way through his tenure as well, and we'll see no respite whatsoever from the ultra-unionist Labour Party under Sir Keir Starmer. I worry that Scotland is being basically chained to a huge weight which is going to drag it under with the United Kingdom. We are in a far better state to survive any kind of international turbulence in the markets, because we have so many resources that belong to us, that are part of our natural territory and are still in the ownership, if you like, of sovereign Scots according to our own constitution. The problem is getting people to accept that they have a constitution, and also getting them to exercise that sovereignty that they already hold. And that is an uphill battle for those of us who've been conditioned for 300 years to the fact that the bigger state next door gets to tell us what we can and can't do, despite the fact that legally they're not allowed to do that. So according to the Union Treaty, England has no right to ownership of any Scottish resources. What they call pooling and sharing is basically plundering and selling off our resources so that we don't see any benefit from them, but everyone south of the border does. So it's a pretty grim situation, and I think I just don't see any reaction to this by our politicians. They're all so busy fighting amongst each other and so busy firefighting all these media reports about how bad their government is that they don't have a chance really to think about the longer term. Sadly, I think that will be reflected in next year's general election. I have no idea what the outcome will be, but unless a coherent plan starts to emerge soon, I fear that next year is just going to be a wasted opportunity, and we end up not just back where we started, but back where we were pre-devolution. It might even be the end of devolution, because we already know that it's meaningless according to the United Kingdom's new legislation, which allow it to do whatever it pleases in Scotland, despite devolved matters supposedly being under our control. So unless you want to stay in this situation, I suggest you get on the phone to your MP, particularly your SNP MP, or your Alba MP, or your Green MP, or MSPs, whoever it is represents your constituency at whichever Parliament they are elected to, and tell them it's high time they stop mucking about and agreed to a common strategy amongst all three parties so that we can get out of this union before we get dragged down with the rest of the UK shipwreck, which is exactly what's going to happen over the next few years. Anyway, that's about it for me today. Sorry it's a bit of a gloomy forecast, but really this is a call to arms rather than an upbeat programme. And like many other commentators on the issue of Scottish sovereignty and independence, this is a slow burn. Despite the fact that the political parties are basically twiddling their thumbs and fretting and clutching their pearls but not actually doing anything, there are many legal and constitutional experts in the background who are preparing the case for self-determination for Scotland at the international courts, so that we can make those representations. But that will take time. It's not going to be a shortcut to independence. But what it will do is give the legal underpinnings for us to have a vote of our own of any kind we like, when we choose to do it. Once that backing has been ruled upon by these international bodies, then international law applies to Scotland and its self-determination, and we're free to make our own feelings known and to act on it when the time comes. Right at the moment, our political parties are basically lapdogs of the UK state, and they're unable to take any action without threatening A, their own careers, B, their own parties, and possibly even devolution itself, which is something that most of the parties in Holyrood are desperate to preserve for very obvious reasons. So we need to get out of this. We're in a cleft stick. Our politicians are basically backed into a corner, threatened with loss of jobs, loss of earnings, loss of their own parliament, loss of control, etc., etc., etc. So if we don't want that to happen, we really need to press on with the legal case, because obviously our politicians are not able to do that for us. In the meantime, do keep the faith, because things will happen, but they're not going to happen at a pace that we really want them to. We need to keep leaning on the politicians, keep being angry, keep making complaints to them, keep pushing them. At least in that case, there is a chance that one or two of them might decide that it's time for a change. And if enough of them do that, then they might be able to force their party to change its manifesto. That's it from IndyCar today. I will see you all again soon. I'm sorry the programmes are a little sporadic at the moment, partly down to my health difficulties, but also down to a dearth of any good news stories coming out of our own country at the moment. So I'll see you in the next few days. In the meantime, keep your peckers up, and remember that Scotland can be independent. Not only can it be independent, it should have been independent anyway for years. And yet, we are sitting here fretting because our politicians will not act. I'll see you soon. Bye for now.